Well, good morning and welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network. I'm Jeff Snyder, and this is BRN AM for Monday, April 13th, 2020. And our top story today, we're going to be breaking down ESG. That's environmental, social, and governance. We're going to learn everything we can this morning about these types of investments. Well, joining me now to discuss this and a lot more is Mona Naqvi. She's a senior director and head of product strategy for ESG for S&P Dow Jones Indices. Mona, thanks so much for joining us on the program this morning.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's a pleasure.
It's great to see you. So before we begin, I just want to check in and see how are you doing? How's the team at S&P Dow Jones Indices doing with all this social distancing and telecommuting?
You know, it's crazy. It's difficult times for everyone indeed, but we're pulling through. We have pretty good systems and we all worked fairly flexibly before anyway. Lots of us had kind of part-time working from home set up. So it's not been too bad. Just grateful that, things are still running.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, obviously give our best to your colleagues and glad you all are doing well and staying safe. So I really am excited to talk with you. Environmental, social, and governance investment options are very prevalent now in today's retirement programs and pension funds. But I thought what might be a good place to start is kind of get a landscape or a look at the macro when it comes to ESG. So this is your area of expertise. What can you tell us about what's happening in the ESG space?
Absolutely. It's a great question, because it can be confusing. A lot of folks sometimes refer to ESG differently. They have, it kind of means different things to different investors. But what I would say is it's helpful to understand the history of the space and where it's come from. Because even though the term ESG is kind of the topic du jour and it's one you hear around all the time, the origins of ESG, or should I say socially responsible investing, or SRI as it's known, the kind of precursor to modern day ESG, has in fact been around for decades. And from around the 60s and the 70s, we saw the first ever kind of socially responsible investing funds that were excluding certain perceived sin sectors from portfolios. So this would be things like tobacco-free, fossil fuel-free, gambling, alcohol, stocks-free investment strategies. And these were, picked up by certain types of investors that were typically values or kind of ethically motivated. And the reason for that is because from a sort of investor standpoint, modern portfolio theory tells us that these types of divestment strategies are potentially riskier and imply the possibility of lower investment returns because of a lack of portfolio diversification. And so for those reasons, it kind of never took off amongst mainstream investors, but was somewhat relegated to those kind of fringe, ethically motivated investors. And I think that perception has plagued the widespread adoption of ESG until recently, because even though ESG is actually something quite different, where ESG is simply the practice of incorporating a wider net of information into the investment process. So whereas SRI was primarily about values, ESG does have values in the equation, but it's so much more. It's also just simply about putting more information into the investment process that isn't traditionally captured by standard investment analysis, that is informing financially material and relevant environmental, social, and governance issues that can actually have a long-term bearing on kind of sustainable long-term value creation. So unlike SRI, which was reserved solely for kind of the values-based investor, ESG is becoming far more palatable to a mainstream investor. And what's changed the past few years is we now have more data than ever before, allowing for more nuanced approaches to index and portfolio construction, basically to the point where you no longer have to necessarily give up returns in order to kind of align your investments with your values. And that's kind of the ethos of ESG.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's amazing. And, I remember when people were putting SRI or SRI-like funds in their retirement and their pension programs. But this seems like, as you're describing, a very different animal, for lack of a better term. It seems like today's environment, people want to be a part of companies that do the right things. They want to be investors into things that do the right things. And it seems like this is not just like the flavor of the month, what often happens in investing where you say, we're going to do this or that. This seems like it's a long-standing endeavor and something that many people are really focused on.
Absolutely. I feel like ESG is really, we're in the midst of a transition. ESG, if you really kind of subscribe to this idea, as I do, that ESG is a window into more information than is traditionally captured by the standard investment process, then you see how maybe we have a systemic issue when it comes to the pricing of assets more generally that aren't taking into account the externalities associated with companies' business activities that we as ordinary people and investors ultimately care about. So it's about really putting a price on those things that aren't always traditionally captured and incorporating them into the investment process for a more kind of efficient allocation of capital.
Your firm is, as far as I know, from my perspective, I mean, you are an intellectual capital provider. You gather a tremendous amount of data. I would imagine that the due diligence process is fairly complex, but to gather all those different data points and to boil it down for customers, clients, in order to make the best investment decisions possible.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head, because the thing about ESG is it is all about the data. It is about information, as I said, that isn't always captured by the standard channels. And there are loads of different approaches to kind of dealing with this. Many different kind of ESG data providers will take what's publicly disclosed from companies. But the problem with that is just doing that, is that companies, there tends to be a bit of kind of consensus around companies amongst their industry peers disclose more or less the same things. No one wants to put their head above the parapet. And especially if you're kind of not performing so well on these issues, there's an incentive for companies to not necessarily disclose. And as things stand currently, particularly in North America or the US in particular, there aren't necessarily kind of regulations in place from the SEC requiring disclosure on these topics. So it's kind of all over the place. And when companies are disclosing, it's not always, it's often patchy, it suffers from time lags. So our approach at S&P is pretty unique in that we take what's publicly disclosed, but we've also been engaging with companies directly for the past 20 years through the SAM Corporate Sustainability Assessment Survey, which is widely regarded by veterans in the space as being the gold standard in ESG data collection and research. We actually recently acquired SAM earlier this year, it was announced, but we've had a long-standing partnership with them, as I said, going back these 20 years, ever since we launched the world's first ever sustainability index, the DJSI, the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, back in 1999, so more than 20 years ago now. And over that time, we've been collecting this information from companies directly, and it's not just a kind of survey monkey, easy multiple choice question, a very resource-intensive, in-depth, critical business driver and endeavor where it takes companies maybe hundreds of hours to complete this. And it's interesting, it used to be filled out by the CSR representative, and now this is becoming a C-suite initiative amongst the CEO and CFO level, because companies are just taking this so much more seriously as investors are starting to pour more and more money into this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's critical to be able to understand and do the due diligence, because if I'm an investor, whether I'm the retail investor or an institutional investor, I want to know that my values and my beliefs kind of align with these companies. And I think the only way to really do that is to get to some level of granularity. Last question for this segment. Is it your belief that you talked about, kind of infer that there are a lack of standards, I guess, here in the States? Do you think that we'll get there in terms of standards, just like we'll have standards for example, alternative investments or real estate investing? Will we have something that's either provided by independent association or something like the Securities and Exchange Commission?
I think that's the direction we are heading in, absolutely. But standards are an interesting point, particularly with an ESG. And this kind of circles back to the first discussion point, which is kind of all these different acronyms and different approaches to ESG, different ways of defining it. And a lot of the criticism sometimes we see in this space is, how come you have so many different score providers that are ranking the same companies completely differently? And what is that all about? And this is an interesting area where I'm not sure whether standardization is necessarily the right approach. Because if you think about it, the difference is, if you really believe that ESG is simply this idea of casting a wider net and putting more information into the investment process to inform an opinion, then it's no different to other financial metrics that we all use, like from different sell side opinion providers, for example, into the investment process. And those fundamental differences are what really drive value. But what it really comes down to, and the reason why I think that sometimes you see that kind of dispersion, is that we can all agree on the underlying direction of the different inputs. For example, we all agree that gender diversity is a good thing, that carbon intensity is a bad thing. The issue comes from how you weight the various emphasis you put on E, S, or G issues and a whole host of other more granular metrics underneath those. And so then it becomes really important for investors to do their due diligence on what's driving the weighting. In our case, it's driven by financial materiality, where we've been working in collaboration with SAM, which was formerly part of Robeco SAM, an asset manager based in Zurich, that has been testing out this data in real time through their portfolio construction and investment management process over the past 20 years. They've been able to see in real time, based on real life portfolio returns, what works and what doesn't. And that has helped to fine tune and calibrate our approach to how we define what is financially material. It's tried and tested, and we know that it works. So that's really kind of our approach to doing so, and how we ultimately get to our overall assessments on ESG scores.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm going to take a quick break, and we come back. We're going to talk more with Mona about ESG, and maybe we'll talk about the applications of ESG in today's environment. So stay tuned right here on BRN AM. Imagine a new television network that will make you richer, healthier, and in control of your financial future. This network is for the policewoman in Nashville, Tennessee, the baker in Dubuque, Iowa, the teacher in Lexington, Kentucky. We want to make the idea of savings and retirement culturally relevant. But what do you see as a defining issue of the midterms, especially for the smaller businesses? I mean, they are the lifeblood of the American economy. Featuring exclusive interviews, current affairs, and docuseries. 33 years old, you retired early.
The philosophy is money only matters if it helps you live a life that you love.
But you got to start thinking about retirement as soon as you get in.
The Broadcast Retirement Network will drive very high engagement with premium partnerships. So this isn't retirement and savings for your parents or grandparents. This is for all Americans. And we're going to change the way you think about money. Welcome to the next frontier of retirement and savings. This is BRN, the Broadcast Retirement Network.
The windows on our homes, they protect us and the ones we love, but they do much more. At Renewal by Andersen, making your home more comfortable is at the center of every window we make. It's why we custom build our windows in America and install them in as little as 1 day. It's why we build our frames with exclusive Fibrex composite material that's 2 times stronger than vinyl. It's why our glass helps keep your home warmer in winter, cooler in summer, and quieter all year long. It's why we stand behind every window with a 20-year limited warranty. Why not help lower your energy costs while giving your home and family the best? Call 1-800-835-6525 to schedule a free in-home consultation. Buy one, get one at 40% off with this special offer. Plus, get special financing with no money down, no monthly payments, and no interest for 1 full year. Renewal by Andersen, the better way to a better window. Call 1-800-835-6525 now.
Welcome back. We're talking to Mona Naqvi, Senior Director for S&P Dow Jones Indices. Mona, thanks so much for sticking with us this morning.
It's my pleasure, Jeffrey. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's great. So we had a great conversation in segment 1 about kind of the basics around ESG, and we could spend, I know you're so passionate, we could spend hours and hours talking about that. And I think we have to do that at some point. Maybe we'll do like a special 5-hour long show on it. But I want to talk about the application of ESG as it relates to retirement plans, as it relates to individual investors, and also the application of the data that you're collecting. So you tell me, where do you want to start?
I think it's helpful to kind of talk about where different investment products are heading. And as an index provider, we can, I can certainly speak to where interest in different types of indices is coming from. Sure. So we talked a little bit earlier about different thematic SRI style investment strategies, where you screen out certain types of sin stocks from the index or the portfolio, be it tobacco or fossil fuel free. And those strategies have been around for a very long time. And actually, they're very successful. There is still a huge degree of appetite for those types of strategies. But what's changed and what's kind of newer to the market is more core ESG integration, where we are seeing different types of strategies catering to the broad market sort of benchmark exposure you would typically expect from our mainstay beta indices, but with a kind of ESG version or kind of a boost to overall ESG performance without necessarily having to give very much up in terms of tracking error and returns. So with that, last year, we launched our flagship new S&P ESG index series, including the S&P 500 ESG. There's several products tied to this in the market, both across Europe and North America, and it's been incredibly successful. And the reason for that is because it's giving investors the opportunity to align their values with their investments. The index methodology, in terms of the 500 ESG, gives you around a 25% boost in ESG score, while at the same time, very closely tracking the underlying parent S&P 500 with less than 75 basis points of tracking error and almost identical risk and return. In fact, over the past 1 year, in the last 3 months of volatility in particular, we've seen that these indices have actually outperformed the parent S&P 500, which is an interesting tidbit, although that's not the objective of these types of products. But needless to say, it's a compelling new tool for investors and pension beneficiaries to look at options for getting in the ESG game without necessarily having to give up the things that they care about in terms of return.
And I think that's a really important point, because oftentimes these types of investments were derided because they didn't perform well. But that, based on what you're saying, I feel bad for the S&P, just the regular S&P 500 indices, because I know you're all one big happy family, but they were beaten. But in all seriousness and all candor, there are many public pension funds, endowments, foundations where this is a big issue. You look at it specifically endowments, many students, faculty members, administration rallying to this cause to be better, right? To be better. Are you seeing widespread adoption, or at least inquiry into using the index, or maybe even replacing or supplementing what they have today?
That's a really great question, because what we've seen in particular, driven by the pension fund and endowment space, has been a lot of noise and action on the divestment type of approaches. And that's usually come from directly, in the case of student and university endowments and the like, from the end pension beneficiaries or the endowment beneficiaries or the students that care about these issues. And for them, sometimes we see it sort of a moral expression that they don't want to be funding activities that aren't aligned with their values. And so that's a space where the kind of SRI style strategies is still very successful. But the key thing that you said that's interesting to me is actually to what extent are these asset owners making the switch from their policy benchmarks to these new ESG flavors and actually targeting returns that are kind of relative to those instead. And that's something that I think will be the next stage of adoption. So far, we've seen a lot of peripheral allocations to ESG, and these new types of tools like the S&P 500 ESG index that offer a core substitution from the traditional beta benchmarks are helping us get along that path towards a point where ultimately we will switch, I hope, the kind of market benchmarks and tools to the ESG versions, make those the benchmarks against which we measure and track and evaluate performance. And then we'll really start to move the needle in terms of influencing company behavior towards more sustainable practices.
And it's not only talking to the asset owners themselves, but also the consulting community, because oftentimes, even if they have a very deep investment bench, they may hire external third party to assist them. And so it's making sure that these folks on the external side understand these types of indices and understand what they can bring. And, to that point, just recent returns. I mean, you said it yourself before that the return streams have been better under this ESG approach in recent periods than the regular S&P. So, I mean, why wouldn't you? If you could do better and be better, why wouldn't you try to be better?
I think that's the key. I've often said if you had two identical portfolios that gave you nearly the same returns and levels of risk, but one made the world a better place, it's kind of a no-brainer which one most people would choose. So I think that's key. But you also raise an interesting point that the whole investing ecosystem and the value chain is not just down to any one player. It's an ecosystem of different groups. And actually, coming back to the asset owners, I actually, to their credit, particularly the asset owners in Europe, we have them, the industry, I think, has them to thank for in terms of driving and catalyzing so much of the interest in ESG, with many of the Nordic and other European public pension funds, for example, that have been the ones to mandate that their managers have to incorporate ESG in their investment practices, at least show a process for considering whether or not it's material. And that has really kind of trickled down into a broader ecosystem, be it asset managers, be it investment consultants or index providers like ourselves, that are kind of meeting their demand. So really, I think that the time is now, momentum is greater than it's ever been before, and all actors are kind of lining up to help move the ball on ESG.
Yeah, well, it's certainly going to be an exciting time for a lot of reasons, but especially in ESG. Mona, we're going to have to leave it here. Really appreciate you being on the program and want to wish you and your colleagues be very safe, and we'll talk to you very soon.
You as well, Jeffrey. Thanks a lot. Take care and stay safe.
And that wraps up this episode of BRN AM. Have a financial topic or someone of interest that you think we should talk to? Drop us a line. And don't forget, for all the news in retirement, markets, technology, personal finance, and so much more, check out today's edition of The Morning Pulse. So until tomorrow, I'm Jeff Snyder. Stay safe, keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes.
Attention! The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services has officially authorized new benefits that Medicare Advantage plans may include. To get the benefits you deserve, you can call the Medicare Coverage Helpline.
Hi, I'm Joe Namath. If you're on Medicare, this is important information. I called the Medicare Coverage Helpline and they instantly looked up my coverage. In this one simple call, they offered to enroll me in a plan that includes rides to medical appointments, private home aides, doctors and nurses' visits by telephone, and even home-delivered meals. The plan also includes dental, vision, hearing, and prescription drug coverage, all at no additional cost.
Don't delay. Call to see if the new benefits are available in your area.
Call the number on your screen now. It's free.
Call 1-800-757-1451. That's 1-800-757-1451.